my computer.
No,
Okay,
no problem, no problem. I mean, the camera is
okay.
very good, so it delivers a very good picture, so that's good.
Yeah, the camera on my computer is worse than the camera on the phone.
The phone cameras are for photo cameras, so naturally they're better. So
Yeah,
anyhow,
yeah.
okay, we're
Okay,
recording, so just start,
okay,
and then you wind it down whenever you want to wind it down, and I use the rest of the time.
okay. One, two, three. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of In the Eyes of Truth. Today with us back is our friend Pascal Lottaz. I was corrected. The Z is silent from neutrality studies. Pascal, welcome back.
Thank you very much for having me back on your channel, Stas.
And anybody who wants to find Pascal, neutrality studies on YouTube, excellent channel, always interesting guests. Pascal, what I want to talk to you about today is the state of Japan. There's a new prime minister. I'm going to butcher her name. Sanaya Takahashi?
Sanae Takaichi.
Takaichi. Okay. I have a superpower, butchering names. Uh, Takaichi. So, as I understand, she was brought to power on protests against mass migration, or is there more to it? That seems to be what the news media is saying, but
No, there's more to it. I mean, she hasn't been far away from power for a while. She is one of the strong people within the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party.
Mhm.
She was a protege of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who was killed back
Who
in
was
20,
assassinated?
who was
Yeah.
assassinated after being out
Mm.
of office. I mean, he was assassinated by just an idiot, just an idiot person who, 2 years after he was out of government, he assassinated Abe at an event for somebody else, and out of because he was that person was part of some cult organization on his mother. But anyhow, I mean, this time the assassination, I would say, had nothing political in the sense that they wanted to get rid of somebody important. It was just a useless political murder. But the Mr. Abe was in power for nearly 10 years. He was Japan's longest serving prime minister.
Right. Mhm.
And again, prime minister of the LDP. And the LDP is this right wing, center right party. I would liken them to the CDU, the old CDU under Angela Merkel. It was a similar thing, relatively large with different wings, very
Mhm.
right, very left. Abe came from the from the right side, but then swung a bit back into the center. And Sanae Takaichi was at least in one, if not in two of his cabinets, a minister, and he
Mhm.
kind of, like a protege of his. And so she inherited a lot of these networks in one part of the party. And last time when we got the last prime minister, a year ago, Mr. Ishiba, she was already one of the top contenders, together
Mhm.
with,
Mhm.
well, Ishiba and one more guy, the son of former Prime Minister Koizumi, young Koizumi. So this time, when Mr. Ishiba stepped down, because he lost in the upper house elections a couple of seats, and he lost, it's true, there he lost to a new right-wing party, or like several other parties. Point being, the LDP lost support, which meant he basically had to take his hat after he had the deal with the Americans, the trade deal more or less done,
Mhm.
and open up the party leadership contest, right? And in that leadership contest, this time she won. Last time got she kind of got circumvented, and Ishiba won because he was kind of a candidate that the least hated of them all, and the others had all beef with each other. And this time she actually won out, and became prime minister because of those internal dynamics. But one must say she's a very, very weak prime minister because the LDP
Oh,
doesn't even hold a majority anymore. They are
mhm.
now and they are in a coalition with a coalition partner um, that enabled her to become prime minister, but it's a minority coalition. I mean, even with a coalition partner, they are not they're not holding an absolute majority. She was able to become prime minister because they managed to convince a few independents to vote with them. So she's now she has a very large sort of Damocles above her. One of the topics that was discussed during that upper house election in that was in October this year, or yeah, October, I think. One of the issues was migration, and so it did play a role, but the much bigger role was actually the scandals within the LDP, and those were also still being discussed. So there was a whole bunch of things that led to this outcome. But it's not the case that she's a strong prime minister because she's kind of riding an anti-immigrant wave. She's rather as weak prime minister because she kind of now has to pick up several pieces and try to make
Mhm.
something out of it. But it was her best chance of becoming prime minister at the moment.
Well, yeah, you got to grab whatever cards you get. Actually, I guess yeah, it's more like whatever cards got left on the table. Well, one of the things she's been bringing up, and she's not the first one, but everybody in the West, all media, they seem to be excited that she wants to sign a peace treaty with Russia because we
Yeah.
don't have a peace treaty with Japan. It's still an armistice, an 80 some year armistice. But all previous prime ministers in Japan were demanding the return of the southern Kuril Islands, which Russia will never do for several reasons. Not just because there's economic wealth there, because they offered to co-develop it with Japan, but from a military standpoint, because there'll be U.S. bases and it allows U.S. submarines to get into Russian interior waters without being detected. So obviously, never that's a major strategic point. Is she going to demand the same thing, or is she even going to move forward with this? What's the situation with that?
It surprised me actually that she brought that topic up of a peace treaty with Russia because I didn't see any immediate necessity for that. But I mean, a positive surprise to me because any kind of like rapprochement and peace is a positive thing. One must also say, you know, the peace treaty is it's an issue on paper only because obviously there's no war between the two, and
Right.
in a sense, you know, Japan joined the sanctions against Russia, of course, but they never sent military equipment to Ukraine. They sent civilian equipment. They sent humanitarian goods, but they refrained from sending any kind of even ammunition to Ukraine. So in a sense, Japan tried to be careful. Also, they never completely abrogated the projects that they had around these islands, these joint development
Right.
programs. They stopped them for now, but they didn't just throw everything out. So in a sense, Japan is kind of, in my view, Japan is waiting until things get
Yeah.
in
Right.
the international scene with the West more normal again. You can kind of continue doing what you did before. So I think maybe this idea of the peace treaty is a step toward that, of signaling of these new governments signaling that, by the way, in principle, we're still open for continuing where we left off. And a peace treaty. I mean, I've never met anyone in Japan who seriously thinks that Russia gives these islands back. I've just never met anyone who thinks that this is realistic. But the problem with these goddamn islands is that you're so emotionally attached to them, even if they're goddamn useless rocks somewhere in the sea, right? Just as with the other islands in the south with China, they are, especially for the nationalist front, the nationalist part, they are very. It's like it's ours or it's theirs, right? So, and it must be
Right.
ours, otherwise we will go to war. And unfortunately, she needs these people in her side. So I cannot see that she could realistically give up that claim, like publicly, and still continue serving because she just would lose these ultra right nationalists, which she actually, or the nationalists within her coalition that she still needs. But Japan sometimes manages to just not talk about stuff. Let's just make a peace treaty. Let's just not talk about it. Let's just not bring it up. And if the other side also doesn't bring it up, then we can move forward. But that would then also depend on Russia actually, you know, agreeing to just leave that topic aside and then create a treaty that just doesn't talk about this, because that's what Japan would need to receive from Russia in a sense in order to be able to do it and then also bring it through parliament for ratification.
That seems like a marriage, and I've had friends actually went down this road. It didn't end well. What about kids? Let's not talk about it right now. We'll decide later. But sooner or later, the issue always pops up. So if you're in a marriage of convenience, I guess, of a sort, you solve such an issue, sooner or later that issue is going to pop up, especially if a portion really, really wants to bring it up. But Japan, yes, Japan hasn't left because we see Japan still in northern Sakhalin,
Yeah,
Sakhalin too, and Japanese businessmen come flooding into every
yeah.
single Russian economic forum on the east. I mean, they're incognito, but they keep flooding in. But let me ask you this, and I never really understood: is Japan so dependent on the U.S. that it's not trying to play Russia, the triangle? I mean, Russia and China allied has got to be a catastrophe for Japan, uh, all things considered.
Not necessarily. I mean, Japan is, in my view, not afraid of Russia. I mean, Russia is not their strategic worry. Their worry
Mhm.
is first and foremost, the one that scares the hell out of Japan is North Korea. Because that one has nuclear weapons and it has the delivery systems. And I mean, the North Koreans very successfully sold the idea that they are constantly at the brink of pushing the button. And the Japanese believe that. They know Tokyo is goddamn within range and the North Korean can end Tokyo at will. That's understood, and this fear is here. The Chinese are also a worry, but more because of sheer size and um, the issue that also this China threat has been hyped up in Japan for a long time. It is a fear, but a lesser one because people in Japan most people in the security circles and political circles and so on understand that China you can rationally deal with, and they've have a long history of dealing with China and having them actually as discussion partners, right? I mean, 2 years ago they even now reinstalled a hotline between the ministries of defense, so the Japanese can call them the Chinese and vice versa, and you have annual discussion meetings of the sub-minister level where the chiefs of the departments actually meet and discuss, and the relationship is not a very happy one, but it's a pragmatic one. And also when it comes to the islands in the south, you have a status quo in which everybody understands who controls which islands, which everybody claims, but you at the moment nobody tries to escalate with this. Actually, the Japanese even try to prevent some of their own nationalist idiots from reaching the Japanese islands which Japan actively controls, in order not to piss off the Chinese. They had this very, very unfortunate experience that back in 2012 or 13, the governor of Tokyo at the time wanted to buy one or two of these islands down there in the South China Sea, um, East China Sea, from the private owners, the private Japanese owners, and then go there and plant a Japanese flag. And the Japanese national government actually said, in order to prevent that, they bought it first from the
Mhm.
private owner. And then guess what the headline was? The headline was Japan nationalizes islands. I was like, and of course, the point was to not let this lunatic in Tokyo, who was governor at the time, Ishihara was his name, Ishihara, I think, to let him go and plant a flag, but this was then completely misunderstood. And I understand how this is misunderstood, but ever since they've been extremely careful of making sure that something like that doesn't happen. And actually, I view the Chinese as understanding this dynamic because again, you don't have escalation there. So that's a long way to go to come back to what I want to tell you. Like Russia is at best third, the number three of the strategic worries of Japan and the security threats in threat perception to Japan. The main issue, of course, is that what NATO is to the Europeans is the US-Japan alliance to the Japanese, and the Japanese, the entire security thinking just centers around the US-Japan alliance. So one thing is sure: the Japanese do not, at any rate, want to piss off the Americans because, well, that's just how it functions, right? So you cannot necessarily have a close relationship to Russia. But what Sanae Takeichi brought in is like, well, at least a peace treaty could be on the cards, so why not? And I don't know what's happening with that idea now, but I find it good that she floated it out.
Mm. Yeah, I know you're short on time today. So unfortunately, it's going to be a bit shorter. But let me ask you one last question on this topic. I mean, Kim Jong Il has shown that he's actually not the crazy psychopath that the Western media likes to put him out. He's a lot more rational, as happens to most leaders in countries. They're a lot more rational in the Western media. Is Japan trying to have any kind of conversation with North Korea, or is this we're afraid they've got the missile? I mean, China and Russia also have the missile, obviously. Is there any kind of outreach, or is this strictly verboten? We don't talk to them.
So Kim Jong Un is a
Yeah,
character which in yeah, Il was his dad. Un is
yeah,
the current one. I mean, um, I am not privy to the, well, let's say the North Korea team within the Japanese Ministry
yeah.
of Defense and so on, but I have some information from the university where I did my PhD at, the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, which nobody knows, but which is basically a mini think tank, apart from being a university for also the national government. And the people there who are the North Korea watchers, I know that they are, although they speak, of course, fluently Korean and so on, they are rather hawks toward North Korea. So the approach is not one of let's reach out and try to see what we can do. It's more, at least that segment of people that I know, they view the most important issue being how to deter the
Um,
North Koreans instead of how to work with them. Although one must say, like Japan um, has tried and Japan has some experiences. And the one thing that to the Japanese, especially the general public, is the most prominent issue is that there are still a couple of alleged hostages, Japanese hostages in North Korea, which were abducted in the
really?
1980s. There were
In
these
the
incidents
1980s?
in the 1980s when there were these
Wow.
incidents when people disappeared from the shores of
Right.
the Sea of
Right.
Japan, and we know that they were taken to North Korea, and some of them by now must have died. I think the North Korean rationale was to bring in people who can then teach the Japanese language and whatnot in order then to educate spies and whatnot. Um, uh, and these the families of these abductees, they are very vocal, and they're very they I mean, everybody knows about them in Japan, and everybody sympathizes with their loss, and they want their family members back, even if they died in the meantime. And this
Right.
is something at the highest priority to must be at the highest priority to every Japanese leader, because of obvious the repercussions on their credibility. The North Korean side obviously doesn't like that discussion, and B, there has also been saying, like, for the longest time they are not really here. Then they said they're, yeah, maybe we have some, but they're dead by now. But then again, they're not really here. So by now, I could well imagine that most of these people are dead or whatnot, and maybe the current regime doesn't even know where their remains are. That wouldn't surprise me if that was the case. So it's you kind of have. Maybe they do. I don't know. I simply don't know. But I know that for the Japanese, this is extremely important, and I know that for the North Koreans, this is by now, I think, extremely embarrassing. So it's gonna make it hard for any kind of rapprochement to happen. Although I must say, if this would be the number one thing, if Russia managed to offer its good offices, to mediate, that
Mhm.
would change a lot, because this is actually, for both sides, obviously, it has nothing to do with security. It more has to do with like not losing face and with the humanitarian issues. If through the mediation of Russia, now that Russia has a security treaty with North Korea, it was possible to do something friendly toward Japan, this would immediately ameliorate the image of Russia and North Korea in the Japanese public mind, where North Korea is still basically that rogue international criminal state, and Russia is also breaker of the peace, right, with Ukraine and so on. Um, I, I really hope that something positive could be done on this level, and also if Russia, for instance, managed to signal to Japan, look, now that we have a security treaty, North Korea is not going to make the decision on nuking Tokyo alone. We can
Mhm.
help you to secure Japan by
Right.
providing shared infrastructure or shared like discussion club, something like that. But this is to some extent also my optimism speaking. But that would be something that I think that if it actually arrived in Japan, and if it sank into the minds here that, oh, there are alternative ways of creating security, short like different from US deterrence. We need to create as much deterrence as possible. If that arrived, I mean, the Japanese would probably be quite grateful actually for de-escalation also in the Korean Peninsula.
Well, I mean, I do remember there were kidnappings. I should talk about it. I do remember I was a kid back then, so I wasn't paying attention that much to politics. But I'm just surprised they never returned them. I was
Yeah,
just
well,
assuming that,
but
that
that's
was
that's the thing. The
that's
North Koreans say it wasn't
incredible.
us. The North Koreans say they just drowned or they died or it wasn't us. But then they said yes, it may be a little bit, and then some were returned
Okay.
in the early 2000s. So it's like there are these horrible things that sometimes screw up potential relationships for a long, long, long time. Just like this, maybe another example, South Korea. Japan and South Korea, if you look at their relationship with the United States, should in theory be best buddies, right? Because they're on the same side of the ledger, right? In theory. But
So
in
should France
practice,
and Germany.
hmm?
So should France and Germany, but they're not.
Yeah, or more like Germany and the Poles. I mean, the Poles remember that there
Okay.
was
Oh yeah,
something, and
that's
the Koreans remember, yeah, there was something, and the Japanese are
yeah.
more like, really? Was there? Anyhow, but one of the main issues between the South Koreans and the Japanese is actually the comfort women issue,
Oh,
which
oh
goes back
yeah, yeah.
to the Second World War, right? In which the Koreans say the Japanese, as a state policy, raped Korean women. They forced them into military brothels at the
Right.
front, and the Japanese they say like, look, we know this happened. We know Korean women were being abused at in by our army. This was never a state policy. It happened, but it was done through middlemen and so on. This was never state policy, and this is such a big fight between them and the South Koreans. It has become such an important issue to the way also in which they view Japan, that even when you have attempts by Japanese to kind of to deal with it, Mr. Abe did that in 2015. Right-wing nationalist Abe actually made a deal with the then female prime minister of South Korea, and said, okay, against all our previous policies, we're going to open this can of worms again, and we're going to agree to paying by the government $5 million into a joint fund in order to compensate these people and have a joint investigation and so on and so on. Although for the longest time they had said it's we dealt with this back in the 60s, this 65, everything is done. Although they said that, okay, let's do it, let's open it up, and we give you that. And then they signed that, and then that prime minister, Park, she got ousted from power and went to prison. And her predecessor, the guy who came after her, Moon, then had a very easy win by scrapping that agreement, saying like, "Oh no, they are trying to screw us anyhow. I mean, we want much more." And the Japanese were like, "Ah, look at it." And the point is not that this is like how problematic the South Koreans are. The problem is that this issue has become detached from historical reality. Historical reality itself cannot inform anymore what happens to the political issue, because the political issue is being
Right.
carried forward
Right.
to the point where South Korean courts actually told a South Korean academic back in 15 or 16, or that she would have to pay compensation to the victims because she concluded in her book that there's no evidence that it was a Japanese state policy. And then, it's like you doing historical research on this doesn't help anymore because it's by now such a thing of a political nature that you have several
Right.
groups that will continuously fight for their interpretation. And the North Korean issue, in my view, has probably already reached very similar levels, where even if you did a joint commission, you could probably not satisfy all parties that have a stake in this political issue. But if one of the two is solvable, I would say it would be the North Korean one. The South Korean one is too entrenched, unfortunately, and it makes people's blood boil on one or the other side about the other one, and those are kind of the worst societal hatreds you can have because they're basically unsolvable.
Yeah. So in fact, a lot of Koreans in Sakhalin are there were used as guest labor, if you want to call it that. But the Japanese from 1905, after the war in 1905, because Japan, all the claims Japan had, the only thing you got out of that war, except a dead generation of men, was South Sakhalin, that Soviet Union face of Russia took back. But there were a lot of Koreans there, and they were given a choice of either going back to North Korea, being shipped back, or staying in the Soviet Union. Most of them stayed in the Soviet Union, and they're fully Russianized, but they remember. You talk to them, they remember the Japanese. There's that element, cultural element there too, that
Of course they
gets
do.
passed on.
And this is where it gets really important, like historical memory or the lack thereof. I just one last point, just to illustrate how difficult the situation can be. One of the things Japan did after the war is to um, they just continued working and tried not to talk about the war, but then because you have to deal with this problem that your former enemy is now your best friend and provides protection and so on. So
Mhm.
while you still had a population that deeply hated also the Americans and the way the war ended, right? Especially on the right side of the spectrum.
Right,
So what
right,
happened is basically 60, 70 years, by now 80 years, of Japan emphasizing the how horrible war is. War is the main issue. So today in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you remember the horrors of war. War is what caused the death of all of these people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in order not to say it was the Americans, right? So the but this is the way to deal with it, and this
right,
actually
right,
worked very well for rekindling this, also the fraternal spirit between the Japanese and the Americans, right? And you focus on war as something that creates suffering. On the good end of this education is that you have a very strong pacifist movement in Japan today. The general population thinks very, very highly of not going to war and of Japan as a peaceful nation. This is very deeply ingrained and very strong. On the negative side, a lot of Japanese, even among my friends, they kind of cannot understand why it is that China is still so bitter about what happened in the 1930s, because it was war, right? I mean, people died in China, people died in Japan, war killed people. Why are they still bitter and so resentful toward Japan? I mean, we all suffered from war. And that's kind of you see where this is coming
right,
from, right?
right.
They just don't
Yes,
understand that in
absolutely.
China, it's about like who started it. And you came and invaded us. And the
Right,
Japanese today, they think like, oh, but if anything is a threat today, then it's China coming to us, right? So you see how there's this communication misalignment that
right,
has to
right.
do not just with like trying to be mean to the other one, but with the way that you remember your own past. And the general public then
Absolutely.
remembers that, and politicians have to play to that because they have to work with what they've got. Mm.
Right, right. I know you need to run, so we'll go ahead and end it at this point. Thank you for joining, Pascal. I need to get you back on again so we can have a full, a longer conversation. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, and see you on the next one.
Thank you, Stas.